You know, some people just aren't built for luxury. They say money can't buy class, and it seems for certain folks, no amount of it can buy them a seat in first class without causing a scene. That's what one flight attendant thought anyway. She saw a young black man sitting in her section, calm as you please, and decided he was the perfect target for her bad day. She chose to put him in his place with a sharp word and a shocking slap. She just didn't realize she wasn't grounding a passenger. She was grounding the entire airline. The recycled air of North Atlantic Airways, Flight 112 from JFK to London Heathrow, tasted of entitlement and stale champagne. In the first-class cabin, the gentle hum of the Boeing 777's environmental systems was a background melody to the clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of conversations about stock options and summer homes in the Hamptons. It was a world hermetically sealed from the chaos of the main cabin, a sanctuary for the global elite. Christine, the senior flight attendant, moved through this sanctuary with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. At 47, her face was a roadmap of long-haul flights, turbulent relationships, and the ever-present pressure of maintaining a mortgage in a city that never slept. Today, the map's lines were etched deeper than usual. A pre-dawn fight with her ex-husband over a late alimony check, a terse text from her son about his tuition, and a passive-aggressive briefing from the gate manager had braided her nerves into a tight, fraying rope. She surveyed her domain. A tech CEO in 2A, a British lord and his wife in 3D and 3G, a smattering of investment bankers. And then in 4K there was him. He was young, maybe early 20s. He wore a simple, well-tailored gray hoodie, expensive-looking but understated sneakers, and noise-canceling headphones over his ears. He was reading a physical book, a thick hardback on quantum computing. He was also black. Christine felt a familiar, unwelcome prickle of suspicion. It wasn't overt, not a conscious thought she would ever voice aloud, but a low-level background process that had been running in her mind for years. It was the quiet assumption that he didn't quite fit. He was probably a musician or an athlete, she reasoned, flush with new money and no idea how to behave. She braced herself for demands, for loud music, for an attitude. Her first interaction was mundane. "Sir, can I get you a pre-departure beverage? Champagne orange juice?" The young man, Ethan Vance, looked up from his book. His eyes were calm and intelligent. He slid his headphones down around his neck. "Just some still water, please. No ice." "Certainly," Christine said, her smile tightening a fraction. The politeness was almost more disarming than the arrogance she had expected. She returned with the water, placing it on the coaster with practiced efficiency. "We'll be pushing back shortly, sir. I'll need to stow that backpack for takeoff." She indicated the slim leather backpack at his feet. "Of course," Ethan replied, not looking up from his book. "It should fit right here in the ottoman." He gestured to the storage space in front of him. "It's policy that all larger bags are placed in the overhead bin for takeoff and landing," Christine stated, her voice a little too sharp. It was a minor point. The bag would have been perfectly safe where he suggested, but the friction of her day needed a place to spark. She felt a perverse need to establish her authority. Ethan finally closed his book, placing a finger to mark his page. He looked at her directly, his gaze steady. "With all due respect, I've flown this route many times. This bag is designed to fit in the footwell storage, and it's never been an issue. It contains some sensitive electronics I'd prefer to keep with me." His tone was even, not argumentative, but factual. To Christine, it sounded like a challenge. "I've flown this route many times." She heard it as, "I'm rich, and I know the rules better than you." The frayed rope of her nerves snapped. "Sir, airline policy isn't a negotiation," she said, her voice dropping into a cold, condescending register. "Your sensitive electronics are not more important than the safety of this cabin. Now either you can hand me the bag, or I can have the captain come back here and explain the rules of flight to you." The quiet cabin seemed to grow quieter. The tech CEO in 2A lowered his newspaper. The British lord's wife glanced over with mild curiosity. This was better than the in-flight movie. Ethan's calm remained infuriatingly intact. He took a slow breath, the kind one takes before dealing with a difficult child. "There's no need for that. I'm simply stating that the policy allows for bags of this size to be stowed here. Perhaps you could double-check your manual? This was the final insult. Her, a 25-year veteran, being told to check a manual by some kid in a hoodie who'd probably gotten the ticket as a gift. The accumulated rage of her mourning, the alimony, the tuition, the manager found its target. It was him. He was the problem. His quiet confidence, his refusal to be intimidated, his very presence in a space she felt he hadn't earned. I don't need to check a manual to know when a passenger is being disruptive, she spat, her face flushing. You people are all the same. You think a little bit of money gives you the right to walk all over everyone. The phrase "you people" hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Ethan's calm finally broke, not into anger, but into a look of profound disappointment. His eyes hardened. I beg your pardon, he said, his voice dangerously low. You heard me, Christine sneered, leaning in closer, her voice a harsh whisper. This is my cabin. You will follow my instructions? Ethan slowly stood up, his 6'2" frame unfolding from the seat. He was taller than her, but he didn't loom. He just stood, forcing her to look up at him. You have a choice, he said, his voice resonating with a quiet power that unnerved her. You can apologize for that remark, and we can forget this happened, or you can continue down this path. I strongly advise you to choose the former. Christine saw it as the ultimate threat. He was trying to intimidate her. In a blind flash of fury and panic, her professionalism, her training, her career, it all evaporated. She acted on pure, raw instinct. Her hand came up, fast and hard. The sound of the slap was shockingly loud in the hushed cabin. It was a sharp, wet crack that echoed off the curved walls. Gasps rippled through the first-class seats. Ethan's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. He didn't flinch, didn't cry out. He simply stood there for a moment, the red imprint of her hand blooming on his dark cheek. Then he slowly turned his head back to face her. The look in his eyes was no longer disappointed. It was glacial. Christine's heart hammered against her ribs. The adrenaline drained away, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. What had she just done? Ethan calmly sat back down in his seat. He didn't say a word to her. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed a single, short text message. He didn't make a call, just one text. He then picked up his book on quantum computing, found his page, and began to read as if nothing had happened. Outside the window, the jet bridge had just pulled away. The powerful engines began to spool up with their signature, rising whine, promising the thunderous acceleration of takeoff. Christine, shaking, stumbled back towards the galley, trying to process the catastrophic miscalculation she had just made. The plane began to roll forward, turning onto the taxiway. Everything was normal, for about 90 seconds. The Boeing 777 lumbered down the taxiway, a graceful giant on its slow procession to the runway. The initial shock of the slap in first class was already settling into a delicious scandal for those who had witnessed it. Christine, hiding in the forward galley, pressed a cold water bottle to her trembling hands. Her mind was a whirlwind of justification and terror. He provoked her. He was arrogant. He challenged her authority. But the stark image of her hand striking his face kept replaying, each time more horrifying. She had assaulted a passenger. That was a fireable offense, a career-ending offense. But the plane was still moving. Maybe he wouldn't report it. Maybe he was too embarrassed. Maybe, she thought with a flicker of hope. He knew he was in the wrong for arguing. The aircraft reached the designated holding spot just shy of runway 31L. The roar of the engines softened slightly, a normal pause as they awaited final clearance from the control tower. The captain's voice, usually a comforting baritone, was expected to crackle over the intercom any second with the familiar, "Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff." The announcement never came. Instead, after a minute of silence, the deep-throated whine of the General Electric engines began to spool down. The powerful thrum that vibrated through the floorboards faded, replaced by an unnerving quiet, an unnatural stillness. Outside, a string of other jets taxied past them, lining up and taking off with roaring certainty, each one a reminder that Flight 112 was suddenly, inexplicably motionless. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The mood in the cabin began to shift from anticipation to annoyance. Murmurs rippled from first class to the back of economy. A passenger in business class called for Christine. She pasted on her customer service smile and walked out of the galley. "Is there a problem?" the man asked, gesturing towards the window. "We seem to be parked." "Just a minor delay from air traffic control, sir," Christine said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "Very common here at JFK. We should be on our way in just a few moments." But she knew it wasn't true. This felt different. There was a cold, deliberate quality to this stillness. Her eyes darted to seat 4K. Ethan Vance hadn't moved. He was still engrossed in his book, the red mark on his cheek a stark accusation. He seemed utterly unconcerned with the delay, as if he were the only person on the plane who knew exactly why they were sitting there. The sight of his calm sent a fresh wave of panic through her. The captain's voice finally came over the intercom, but it lacked its usual confident cadence. It was tight, strained. "Folks, this is Captain Miller up in the cockpit. Apologies for the delay. We seem to have a ground control issue that we're working to resolve. We don't have a time frame for you just yet, but we'll be sure to pass on any information as soon as we get it. We appreciate your patience." A ground control issue. It was vague, corporate speak, for we have no idea what's happening. 30 minutes crawled by. The cabin was growing hot and stuffy without the engines running at full power. Passengers were getting restless, their grumbling growing louder. Christine and the other flight attendants patrolled the aisles, offering water and placating smiles, their own anxiety mounting with every passing minute. Christine studiously avoided the right side of the first-class cabin, unable to face Ethan. Then her personal tablet, the one issued by the airline for flight manifests and internal communication, buzzed with an alert. It was a fleet-wide operational memo, marked urgent. She opened it, her blood turning to ice as she read. Subject: immediate operational halt. All VGL cargo memo. Effective immediately, all North Atlantic Airways aircraft currently transporting or scheduled to transport cargo for Vance Global Logistics are to be grounded. Cease all loading and unloading operations. Do not depart. Await further instruction from the executive level. No exceptions. Christine stared at the screen. Vance Global Logistics, VGL. She knew the name. Everyone at the airline knew the name. VGL was not just a client, it was the client. They were a titan of international shipping and supply chain management, and their exclusive air freight contract for the North Atlantic corridor was the financial bedrock of the airline. It was worth billions. Grounding their cargo was financial suicide. It meant dozens of planes all over the world were suddenly stopping just like they had. A horrifying, impossible connection began to form in her mind. Vance. She dared to look at seat 4K. Ethan Vance. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence. A common name. This young man in a hoodie couldn't possibly be connected to a global logistics empire. But as the delay stretched to a full hour, the illusion shattered. Through the cockpit door, Christine could hear the captain's increasingly frantic voice on the radio, not to air traffic control, but to the airline's central operations hub. Words like unprecedented, executive override, and no explanation drifted into the cabin. The definitive moment came in the form of flashing blue and red lights. 2 airport security vehicles and a black Lincoln Town car sped across the tarmac, ignoring all protocol, and screeched to a halt beside the stranded 777. The ground crew, looking utterly bewildered, began to push the jet bridge back towards the aircraft door. The passengers pressed against the windows, phones out, recording the bizarre scene. The main cabin door was opened with a pneumatic hiss. Christine stood frozen as 2 stern-faced Port Authority officers boarded, followed by a man in a tailored suit whose expression was a mask of pure panic. She recognized him from corporate newsletters. It was David Henderson, the airline's executive vice president of North American operations. He was one of the most powerful men in the company, and he wasn't looking at the captain. He wasn't looking at the crew. His eyes scanned the first-class cabin with frantic urgency until they locked onto seat 4K. He strode past Christine as if she were invisible, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. He stopped beside Ethan's seat. David Henderson, a man who commanded a multi-billion-dollar division, practically bowed. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice trembling slightly. On behalf of North Atlantic Airways, I cannot begin to express our deepest, most profound apologies. Ethan Vance slowly looked up from his book on quantum computing. He folded the corner of the page and closed it gently. Is there a problem, Mr. Henderson? He asked, his voice still quiet, but now it carried the weight of an entire paralyzed airline. The first-class cabin had become a theater, and every passenger was holding their breath. David Henderson, the executive VP, was sweating under the cabin lights, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume. The two Port Authority officers stood like statues by the door, their presence transforming the luxury cabin into a crime scene. A problem, Mr. Vance? Henderson stammered, wringing his hands. Yes, a catastrophic problem, one we were not aware of until approximately 75 minutes ago. He cast a venomous glare in Christine's direction. It was a look that conveyed pure, unadulterated fury. In that single glance, Christine knew her life as she knew it was over. The name wasn't a coincidence. The text message wasn't a bluff. The young man she had slapped was Ethan Vance, son of Robert Vance, the founder, CEO, and iron-fisted ruler of Vance Global Logistics. Ethan remained seated, forcing the executive to address him from a position of supplication. And what seems to be the nature of this catastrophe, David? The use of Henderson's first name was a subtle assertion of power, a reminder of who was truly in control of the situation. Henderson swallowed hard. Your father contacted our CEO, Richard Sterling, directly. As of an hour ago, VGL has suspended its global contract with North Atlantic Airways, pending a full review of this incident. He gestured vaguely at Ethan's face, where the red mark was still faintly visible. The financial exposure is, well, it's immediate and it's devastating. We have cargo planes being held on tarmacs in Frankfurt, Hong Kong, and Dubai. Our stock is projected to open down 30%. It's an extinction-level event for us, Mr. Vance. A wave of understanding and shock washed over the other passengers. This wasn't about a delayed flight anymore. This was a corporate war, and they were sitting on the front line. The tech CEO in 2A, who managed a fund that likely held North Atlantic stock, looked physically ill. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the information without a flicker of surprise. My father is a man who values respect and partnership. He believes that how a company treats any individual is a reflection of how it will treat his business. It appears our belief in your company's standards was misplaced. It was the act of a single, rogue employee, Mr. Vance, not representative of our airline, I assure you, Henderson pleaded, his voice rising in desperation. He finally turned his full attention to Christine, who felt pinned by his gaze. Her, it was her. The captain, a grim-faced man named Frank Miller, had emerged from the cockpit and was standing beside Henderson, his face ashen. He had heard everything. What happened exactly? Captain Miller asked, his voice low and firm, directed not at the executive, but at his own crew and the passengers. The British lord in 3D cleared his throat. It was quite extraordinary, Captain, he said, his voice carrying the effortless authority of aristocracy. That flight attendant, he pointed a damning finger at Christine, was needlessly aggressive with the young man over his carry-on bag. He was perfectly polite. She became belligerent, used rather unfortunate language, and then she struck him, assaulted him, plain and simple. My wife and I saw the entire thing. His wife nodded in vigorous agreement. Utterly disgraceful. I've never seen such a shocking lack of professionalism. Every head in first class nodded. There was no escape. Christine was surrounded by a jury of the world's most powerful people, and they had already delivered their verdict. Henderson's face was a mask of cold fury. Christine, he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, is this true? Did you strike Mr. Vance? Christine opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The web of justifications she had spun in her mind, the stress, the provocation, seemed pathetic and flimsy under the weight of reality. The reality was a frozen 777, a multi-billion-dollar contract in flames, and the contemptuous eyes of her boss fixed on her. He was being difficult, she whispered, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Difficult? Henderson's voice was a whip crack. Difficult? This young man's father pays the salaries of half the people in this company. His business is the reason your pension exists. You didn't just strike a passenger, you detonated a bomb in the center of this airline. The board is on an emergency call. The media is already sniffing around. We don't even know if the company will survive the week. He took a deep breath, composing himself before turning back to Ethan. Mr. Vance, we will, of course, be deplaning you immediately. A private car is waiting to take you wherever you need to go. Your father specified you were not to remain on this aircraft or fly with this airline. We are also prepared to offer a settlement, a sum of any amount you deem appropriate for the distress this has caused. Ethan held up a hand, silencing him. This isn't about money, David. My father and I have plenty of it. This is about principle. He finally stood up, grabbing his slim leather backpack. He looked at Henderson, then at Captain Miller. Your airline has a systemic problem, a culture problem. Today it was me. Who was it yesterday? A student? A tourist who didn't speak perfect English? Who will it be tomorrow? This isn't about one employee having a bad day. This is about a rot that allowed her to feel comfortable acting this way. He then looked directly at Christine. There was no anger in his eyes now, only a chilling emptiness. It was the look one gives to something that has ceased to matter. I hope it was worth it, he said softly. With that, he walked towards the open door, Henderson scurrying after him like a nervous courtier. Ethan paused at the threshold, turned back to Captain Miller, and said, For what it's worth, Captain, you and your co-pilot have been nothing but professional. This has nothing to do with your cockpit. He then disappeared down the jet bridge, leaving a chasm of silence in his wake. The moment Ethan Vance was out of sight, the dam of professional decorum broke. David Henderson spun on his heel, his face contorted with a level of rage Christine had only ever seen in movies. The panic was gone, replaced by the cold fury of a man trying to salvage a shipwreck. His focus was singular and absolute, the source of the disaster. Her. Captain Miller, Henderson snapped, this woman is a liability to this aircraft and this company. She is to be removed, now. Captain Miller, a man who prided himself on procedure and calm, looked torn. Firing a crew member on the tarmac was almost as unprecedented as the grounding itself. But one look at Henderson's face and one thought of the global chaos unfolding because of the woman standing before him hardened his resolve. Christine, the captain said, his voice heavy with finality, your employment with North Atlantic Airways is terminated, effective immediately. Your credentials are revoked. Please collect your personal belongings. The Port Authority officers will escort you from the aircraft. The words hit Christine like a physical blow, harder than the slap she had delivered. Terminated, revoked, escorted. It was a brutal, swift guillotine to a 25-year career. What? She gasped, looking from the captain to Henderson. You can't just fire me here. On the plane. I can and I am, Henderson shot back, stepping forward. Do you have any idea what you've done? Forget being fired. We're assessing our legal options. Assault, willful destruction of corporate assets. And yes, that's what this is. Your little tantrum might cost this company billions of dollars. You're lucky if you don't end up in prison. The two Port Authority officers moved from the doorway, their expressions impassive. They weren't airport security. They had the hard-edged look of law enforcement. They stopped on either side of her. Ma'am, we need you to come with us, one of them said, his voice polite but unyielding. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. No, I haven't done anything wrong. He was provoking me. Everyone is taking his side because he's rich, she cried, her voice cracking. She looked desperately at the other flight attendants, who were huddled by the galley, their faces a mixture of fear and pity. No one met her eye. She was radioactive. Ma'am, let's not make this more difficult, the second officer said, his hand resting near his sidearm. The passengers were watching, their phones held up, recording her humiliation. The Lord and his wife looked on with grim satisfaction. The tech CEO just shook his head, likely calculating his losses. She was the villain in their story. The spectacle before the flight was inevitably canceled. Get your things, Captain Miller repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. Numbly, Christine stumbled toward the crew locker. Her hands shook so violently she could barely work the latch. She pulled out her purse and a small tote bag. A quarter century of service, countless holidays spent at 35,000 feet, Missed birthdays, stressful turnarounds, difficult passengers, all of it reduced to this: a walk of shame past a jury of millionaires, escorted by police. As the officers led her toward the door, her eyes fell on the seat Ethan Vance had occupied. On the small table next to it was his book, Principles of Quantum Mechanics. Not a flashy novel or a business book, a dense, scientific text. In that moment, a devastating realization hit her. She hadn't seen a rich kid in a hoodie. She had seen a stereotype. She had overlaid her own prejudices, her own bitterness and anger, from her messy life, onto a complete stranger. She had judged a book by its cover, and the book turned out to be a subject she couldn't possibly comprehend. Her arrogance, her assumption that she knew who he was, that was the spark. The slap was just the fire. As she was led across the jet bridge, the clicking of phone cameras followed her. The cool air of the terminal felt foreign. Behind her, she heard Captain Miller's voice come over the plane's intercom, formal and resigned. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain again. North Atlantic Airways Flight 112 to London Heathrow has been canceled. We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience." The doors to the jet bridge swished shut behind her, sealing her off from the world she had known for her entire adult life. Ahead of her was not the familiar bustle of the airport, but a small, sterile security office where her ID would be confiscated and a statement would be taken. Her life was no longer measured in flight routes and time zones, but in the seconds ticking away since she had decided to slap the wrong passenger. She had wanted to put a man in his place, and in doing so, had obliterated her own. The world outside the bubble of Flight 112 was swift and merciless. Before Christine had even finished her perfunctory, humiliating debrief with airport security and a stony-faced airline lawyer, the story was already metastasizing across the internet. It hadn't been leaked by the airline or the Vances. It had been broadcast by the passengers. The British Lord's wife, a prolific social media user with a blue checkmark and a massive following among the London elite, had posted a detailed first-hand account. The tech CEO had fired off an email to a journalist friend at the Wall Street Journal. Another passenger had uploaded a high-quality video of Christine being escorted off the plane by the officers. The headlines were brutal. "Airline in chaos. Flight attendant assaults billionaire heir, grounds global fleet. You people, racism at 30,000 feet costs North Atlantic Airways billions." Meet Christine Peterson, the flight attendant who single-handedly crippled an airline. They had her name, Peterson. They had her photo, a grainy screenshot from their video. By the time she was released from the security office, not charged with a crime, as the Vances had declined to press charges, a move of strategic magnanimity that only made her look more pathetic, her digital ghost was already infamous. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, a hornet's nest of hatred. Her social media profiles were flooded with vile comments. Reporters were camped outside her modest Queens apartment building. She was fired, disgraced, and now a public spectacle. The days that followed were a blur of shame. She was formally blacklisted, her name and file flagged with a do not hire notice that was shared across all major carriers through industry back channels. Her 25 years of experience were now worthless. She applied for jobs at budget airlines, charter companies, even as a trainer at a flight academy. The answer was always the same, a polite but firm no. Her name was poison. The financial consequences for North Atlantic Airways were apocalyptic. The stock plummeted 42% in the first day of trading. The suspension of the VGL contract punched a $2 billion hole in their annual revenue forecast. Emergency board meetings, frantic negotiations, and public apologies did nothing to staunch the bleeding. Robert Vance was implacable. He refused to even take a meeting with NWRC CEO. The story of the Vances was one of quiet, formidable power. Robert Vance had built his logistics empire from a single delivery truck in the 1980s into a global behemoth by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than his competitors. He was known for his loyalty to his partners and his absolute intolerance for incompetence and disrespect. The attack on his son, a quiet, brilliant young man who was finishing his PhD in physics at MIT, was not just an insult, it was a fundamental breach of the trust upon which business was conducted. Ethan Vance, for his part, remained completely silent publicly. He gave no interviews. His only statement was through a family spokesperson who said, "The Vance family considers this a private matter that is being handled directly with the leadership of North Atlantic Airways. Their goal is not punitive, but to ensure that such a failure of corporate culture and employee conduct is never repeated." This calculated, dignified response was far more damning for the airline than any public tirade would have been. It framed the issue not as a personal spat, but as a deep-seated corporate cancer. For Christine, the world shrank to the size of her apartment. Friends from the airline stopped calling. Neighbors averted their eyes. The alimony check she had been fighting for was now a pittance against the mountain of bills and the utter lack of prospects. She spent her days watching the news, seeing the empire she had unwittingly torpedoed flounder on the rocks of her own prejudice. Layoffs were announced at Attendant, first in the cargo division, then in administrative roles, then devastatingly among the cabin crews. People she had worked with for decades were losing their jobs because of her. The weight of that collateral damage was a crushing stone on her chest. One rainy afternoon, a month after the incident, she saw a news report. After weeks of back-channel negotiations facilitated by a team of high-powered lawyers and crisis managers, a deal had been reached. Vance Global Logistics would resume a portion of its contract with North Atlantic Airways, saving the airline from complete collapse. But the terms were brutal. The airline's CEO, Richard Sterling, was forced to resign. The entire executive board was to be restructured, and the centerpiece of the deal was something new, something that would be inextricably linked to the incident on Flight 112. Robert Vance had mandated that the airline establish and fund, in perpetuity, a $50 million initiative. It would be called the Vance Equity and De-escalation Initiative. Its purpose was to create a new industry standard for mandatory, rigorous, and continuous anti-bias, anti-racism, and conflict de-escalation training for every single employee, from the baggage handlers to the new CEO. A portion of VGL's future payments would be funneled directly into this fund, ensuring it could never be cut in a budget crisis. It wasn't about revenge. It was about forcing change. Robert and Ethan Vance had taken a moment of ugly, personal prejudice and leveraged it to rebuild a piece of an entire industry in their image, one based on respect, accountability, and the understanding that "you people" was not just a phrase, but a symptom of a disease that had to be cured. For Christine Peterson, watching the news, it was the final, bitter confirmation. She wasn't just a casualty of the story, she was its catalyst, the ugly footnote in a revolution she had never intended to start. 5 years is a lifetime. For Christine Peterson, it was a penance. The firestorm of her public shaming eventually died down, as all internet infernos do, leaving behind only the scorched earth of her former life. The name Christine Peterson was no longer a trending topic, but a permanent, low-level digital stain, easily found by any potential employer with a search engine. The aviation industry remained a locked door. Her savings dwindled, then disappeared. The Queen's apartment was lost to foreclosure. Humiliation became a constant companion. She moved to a small, anonymous town in the Midwest, taking a series of jobs that were a universe away from the crisp uniforms and global travel she had once known. She worked nights stocking shelves at a 24-hour supermarket, the fluorescent lights humming a monotonous tune of failure. She drove for a rideshare service, her face hidden by a baseball cap, praying no one would ever recognize her. She was 52 now, but looked older. The stress had carved new lines onto her face, deeper than any amount of jet lag ever had. The bitterness had hardened into a quiet, weary resignation. She rarely thought about the incident on Flight 112 anymore. It was a locked room in her mind, a place of such profound shame and regret that her psyche refused the key. One evening during her dinner break at the supermarket, she sat in the drab break room, scrolling through a news aggregator on her cheap smartphone. An article caught her eye, published in a major business journal. The Vance Standard, How a Crisis Reshaped Aviation Culture 5 Years On. Her finger trembled as she tapped the link. The article detailed the sweeping success of the Vance Equity and De-escalation Initiative. It had become the gold standard not just for North Atlantic Airways, which had stabilized and was slowly regaining its reputation, but for the entire industry. Other airlines, pressured by corporate clients and a more aware public, had adopted similar models. The VEDI training, as it was known, was now a mandatory certification for flight crews worldwide. The article featured a new interview with Ethan Vance. He wasn't a student anymore. Dr. Ethan Vance was a respected physicist, leading a research team at Caltech. There was a photo of him, older, bearded, standing in front of a whiteboard filled with complex equations. He looked confident, happy. The journalist asked him about the 2025 incident. "I rarely think about the person involved," Dr. Vance said, his quoted words radiating the same calm he'd had on the plane. "To focus on her is to miss the point. She was a symptom of a systemic issue. People aren't born with those prejudices. They're conditioned by the cultures they exist in. Our goal wasn't to punish one person, but to recondition the culture, to create an environment where an employee under stress doesn't default to bias, but to training, to empathy, to de-escalation," he continued. "The real success of the initiative isn't that North Atlantic has a better record now. It's that thousands of flight attendants, pilots, and ground crew across the world have been given new tools. Maybe they've used that training to help a passenger with a panic attack, to de-escalate a conflict over a mask, to see a person instead of a stereotype. That's the legacy, not the slap, but what we all chose to build in response to it." Christine put her phone down on the grimy table. The cold coffee in her styrofoam cup suddenly seemed appropriate. He didn't even think of her. She, who had lost everything, was a footnote in his life, a symptom. Her personal catastrophic failure had been absorbed, processed, and transformed into a positive force for thousands of people. A strange, complex emotion washed over her. It wasn't forgiveness for herself. It wasn't absolution. It was a profound, aching sense of irony. In her moment of greatest weakness, fueled by a prejudice she had refused to acknowledge, she had inadvertently become the agent of a change she would never benefit from. She had thrown a stone of hate into a pond, and the ripples that came back were waves of progress, washing over an entire industry, leaving her alone and untouched on a desolate shore. She finished her coffee, the bitterness of it a familiar taste. Her break was over. The fluorescent lights of the canned goods aisle beckoned. She stood up, straightened her cheap blue vest, and walked back to the sales floor to continue stocking the shelves. A ghost in a story that was no longer about her. The world for Christine Peterson had become a series of small, dark spaces, the cramped confines of her studio apartment, the narrow aisles of the Value Mart supermarket, and tonight, the driver's seat of her 10-year-old sedan. Driving for a rideshare service called Relay was the latest in a string of desperate measures to keep the lights on. It offered a perverse form of comfort. She was a ghost, a transient presence in other people's lives, her face briefly illuminated by a phone screen before fading back into the anonymity of the road. Tonight, the anonymity felt like a shroud. A bitter winter wind howled across the flat Midwestern landscape, whipping flurries of snow against her windshield. It was almost 2 a.m., the hour when loneliness felt most acute. Her phone chirped, pulling her from a listless daze. A pickup request. The location was Miller Regional Airport, a tiny airfield 20 miles out of town that mostly serviced private planes and the occasional diverted flight. Probably a pilot or a stranded businessman, she figured. The fare would be good. She accepted. The airport terminal was a single, brightly lit room, mostly empty save for a handful of weary travelers huddled near a coffee machine. A flight from Denver to Chicago had been diverted due to a blizzard over Lake Michigan. Her passenger was waiting just outside the doors, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 23. She was wearing the smart navy blue uniform of North Atlantic Airways. Christine's heart seized. It felt as if a switch had been flipped, plunging her into an ice bath. For 5 years, she had managed to build a wall between her present and her past. Now the past was getting into her car, bringing with it the scent of jet fuel and corporate-issued perfume. "Thanks so much for coming out," the young woman said, sliding into the back seat and bringing a gust of frigid air with her. "I thought I was going to be stuck here all night. I'm Sarah." "Christine," she replied, her own name feeling foreign and heavy on her tongue. She kept her eyes fixed on the road, her face obscured by the darkness and the shadow of her baseball cap. "What a night," Sarah chattered, relieved to be in a warm car. 3 hours circling O'Hare, then they send us to this place. Passengers were starting to lose their minds. But hey, that's the job, right? Christine just grunted in what she hoped was a non-committal agreement. Her hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. She could feel the Attendant logo on the woman's uniform like a brand on her own skin. We had one guy, Sarah continued, her voice full of the earnest energy of a new recruit who still loved her job, who was just furious, screaming that he was going to miss a multi-million-dollar deal. He was getting really personal with my colleague, just belligerent, but we handled it. A note of pride entered her voice. I remembered my VDI training. Christine's knuckles went white. VDI, the Vance Equity and De-Escalation Initiative, the program born from her disgrace. She felt a wave of nausea. Instead of arguing with him, Sarah explained, eager to share her professional triumph, I just started with, it sounds like this delay is putting you in an impossible position. That must be incredibly stressful. I just listened, let him vent, validated his frustration without validating his behavior, pulled him aside, got him a water, spoke to him quietly. Within 10 minutes, he was calm, apologized even. The captain was so impressed. She laughed a little. It's amazing stuff, that training. They drill it into us from day one. They say it changed the whole culture of the airline. It was all because of this horrible incident that happened years ago. Some flight attendant physically assaulted a passenger. Can you even imagine? I guess something good came out of it, though. That's what my instructor always said. Something good came out of it. The words echoed in the small car, a judgment delivered by an innocent, unwitting executioner. Christine wanted to scream. She wanted to pull over and throw this cheerful, competent young woman out into the snow. Instead, she just drove, the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers counting out the seconds of her silent agony. She was a historical artifact, a cautionary tale used to train her replacement. They turned off the main highway onto a poorly lit county road, a shortcut to the cluster of hotels near the interstate. The snow was coming down harder now, a thick white curtain that swallowed the beams of her headlights. And then she saw it. Up ahead, skewed across the road, were two cars. A late-model pickup truck was angled awkwardly, its front bumper crumpled. A much older, beaten-up sedan was nose down in a snowy ditch. The scene was illuminated by their hazard lights, blinking in a frantic, mismatched rhythm. A large, red-faced man in a thick work coat had gotten out of the truck and was stomping towards the sedan. The driver's door of the sedan opened, and a kid scrambled out. A boy, maybe 17, skinny and tall, wearing a hoodie. He was black. He was trembling, whether from the cold or fear, Christine couldn't tell. Are you blind? The man from the truck roared, his voice carrying easily over the wind. You cut me off. Look what you did to my truck. You people can't drive worth a damn. You people. The phrase struck Christine with the force of a physical blow. It was the same poison she had spewed, the same casual, dismissive bigotry that had detonated her life. Time seemed to warp, and for a terrifying second, she was back on Flight 112, the air thick with entitlement and her own curdled rage. Oh my God, Sarah whispered from the back seat. He's terrifying. We should call the police. The boy was stammering, trying to explain. I'm so sorry, sir. The road is so slick. I tried to stop. Don't you lie to me, the man shouted, taking another aggressive step forward, jabbing a finger in the boy's face. The boy flinched back, stumbling against his car. In that moment, the 5 years of shame, of running, of hiding, coalesced into a single sharp point of clarity. The self-pity, the weary resignation, it all burned away, replaced by a feeling she hadn't felt since before the incident. Purpose. She saw the scene not as a memory, but as a test, an echo demanding a different response. Call 911, Christine said, her voice low and steady, startling both herself and Sarah with its firmness. Tell them there's been an accident and one of the drivers is being aggressive. Before Sarah could respond, Christine had already pulled her car to a safe stop on the shoulder, put on her own hazards, and was getting out. The wind hit her, biting and fierce, but she barely felt it. She walked towards the flashing lights, not with the arrogance she once possessed, but with the deliberate calm of someone entering a quarantine zone. She didn't address the angry man. That was a lesson she had learned in the cruelest way possible. You don't engage the fire, you protect what it's about to burn. She walked directly to the boy, creating a physical barrier with her own body. Are you hurt? She asked, her voice clear and calm. The boy looked at her, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. He shook his head. Okay, Christine said, keeping her focus on him. I've already had my passenger call for help. The police and an ambulance are on their way. Just stay calm. It's going to be all right. The angry man turned his fury on her. Who the hell are you? This is none of your business, lady. Get out of here. Christine finally turned to face him. She kept her hands visible, her posture non-threatening. She remembered the words from the article, the principles Ethan Vance had spoken of. De-escalate. See the person, not the stereotype. This man wasn't just an aggressor, he was scared too. Scared of the damage, the insurance, the liability. His anger was a shield. Sir, my name is Christine, she said, her voice even. I know you're upset, and you have every right to be. This is a bad situation for everyone. But right now, the most important thing is making sure nobody's injured. The police are on their way to sort out all the details. Let's just give them some space and let them do their job. She wasn't accusing him. She was validating his anger while simultaneously taking control of the narrative, shifting the focus from blame to safety. It was a verbal maneuver she had never known she was capable of. The man was taken aback. He had been ready for a fight, a shouting match. He wasn't prepared for calm competence. He hit my truck, he sputtered, his rage losing some of its focus. I understand, Christine said, nodding. And that needs to be documented properly. That's what the police are for. Yelling at him isn't going to undent your bumper, and it's just making a bad night worse for everyone, including you. From the corner of her eye, she saw Sarah, still on the phone, watching from the car with a look of utter astonishment. The distant wail of a siren began to cut through the howl of the wind. The sound broke the spell. The man grumbled, shot one last dirty look at the boy, and stomped back to his truck to wait. Christine stayed with the boy until the first police car arrived. She gave a brief factual statement to the officer, then walked back to her car, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She got back in the driver's seat and closed the door, plunging the car into a sudden, profound silence. The only sounds were the engine, the wipers, and her own ragged breathing. That was, Sarah began from the back seat, her voice filled with awe. That was incredible. You were so calm. You knew exactly what to say. It was pure VEDI in action. Where did you learn to do that? Christine couldn't answer. She put the car in drive and pulled away, leaving the flashing red and blue lights behind. The irony was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had just perfectly executed the protocol that existed only because of her own spectacular failure to do so. She had protected a young black man from the very type of blind prejudice she had once embodied. She dropped Sarah at a brightly lit Marriott, a world away from the darkness on the county road. Sarah pressed a $20 bill into her hand as a tip. Thank you, the young flight attendant said, her eyes shining with admiration. Seriously, you might have saved that kid from getting hurt. You're a hero. Christine watched her walk into the lobby, then drove away. A hero. The word was so absurd, so grotesquely misapplied, that a sound escaped her throat. It started as a choked gasp and turned into a sob. She pulled the car over to the side of an empty street, turned off the engine, and wept. For 5 years, she had shed no tears. She had been too numb, too ashamed, too consumed by the slow, grinding misery of her life. But these were different tears. They weren't for her lost career or her public humiliation. They were tears for the woman she had been, for the boy in the ditch, for the yawning chasm between her past and the stranger she had just become for 10 short minutes. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a reckoning held in the dark, silent cabin of a rideshare car on a forgotten street, a turbulent and painful landing after years of being lost in the storm. So what do we take away from a story like this? It's easy to cheer for the downfall of someone like Christine, to say she got what she deserved. But the story of the Vances pushes us to think bigger. They could have destroyed a company for revenge, but instead they chose to rebuild it. They used their immense power not just to punish, but to enact permanent, positive change. This story is a stark reminder that our actions, especially those born from prejudice, have consequences that can ripple out in ways we can never imagine. It shows that true power isn't about the ability to crush your enemies, but the wisdom to force them to become better. What did you think? Was the airline's punishment fitting? Was Christine's fate too harsh? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you found this story compelling, please hit that like button, share it with a friend, and make sure you're subscribed for more real-life drama.